So good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to today's discussion, the 2020 US election, What Happens Now? My name is Arjun Tremblay. I'm an assistant professor with the Department of Politics and International Studies at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Regina, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's event. The Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, is a provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy administration. JSGS is a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since its inception in 2007, JSGS has swiftly become one of Canada's leading public policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical home is located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis. This lecture would not have been possible without the support of our partner, the Max Bell Foundation. And at this moment, I am pleased to introduce Alan Northcott, president of the Max Bell Foundation, to provide some background on the foundation and the work that they do. Alan.
Thanks, Arjun. Max Bell Foundation is proud to be partnering with JSGS to help bring this important conversation to all of you who might be coming from. For my part, I'm coming to you from Calgary. This is Treaty 7 territory. It's the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. That's the Kainai-Piikani Nations, and also the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Axis-Nakota Nations and Métis Nation Region 3. I was thinking about the land acknowledgement this morning. It seems especially apt today in the context of the election. In a time of widespread misinformation and polarization, I think the ideas of truth and reconciliation feel more urgent. I'm just as keenly interested as all of you are to hear what our terrific panelists have to say, so I'll be very brief. I just want to use a bit of time to tell you a bit about the Bell Foundation. The foundation has a pan-Canadian mandate. Using proceeds from the endowment that Max himself left on his death in 1972, we make grants to charitable organizations across the country. And the purpose of those grants is to improve public policy. And so what does that mean in practice? Well, as you no doubt all know, there are lots of groups and organizations across civil society who want to contribute to better public policy. We look for opportunities to support them, whether they are college or university departments, frontline service delivery charities, think tanks, or others who have important expertise, experience, and evidence that should be part of the public policy conversation. Our areas of interest are health and wellness, education, and environment, but we also have cross-cutting interests in the well-being of Indigenous individuals and communities, and the impacts of new technologies on society and economy. You can read all about us online at maxbell.org, maxbell.org. And if you think there might be a way for us to work together, I would encourage you to be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your words and for supporting today's event. To help the event run smoothly, I would kindly ask if all attendees could stay muted and turn off their video during the presentation portion of the event. Feel free to turn your videos back on for the question and answer period. The format of today's event is as follows. Our speakers in total will be given approximately 30 minutes for all of the presentations. Following the presentations, our panel will entertain questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Zoom chat function to send your questions to me, Arjun Tremblay, and I will endeavor to read your question to our panelists. So questions can be sent at any time during the presentation. And if you have logistical questions today, please do not hesitate to send a message to Karen Jaster-Laforge via the chat function. And please note that as with all of JSGS's public lectures, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes introducing our panelists, and I'll be introducing them to you in alphabetical order, starting with Marshall Auerback, who is a market commentator and research associate at the Levy Institute in Bard College. Marshall is currently a research associate, writer for the Independent Media Institute, which you can find at independentmediainstitute.org, and a contributor to AmericanCompass.org, a newly established think tank formed to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. Prior to that, he was a financial market practitioner for over 25 years and has also worked as director for institutional partnerships for the Institute for New Economic Thinking from July 2012 to July 2015. Welcome, Marshall Auerback. Next, we have Dr. Cheryl Camillo, who's assistant professor at the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy and associate at the North American Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. Dr. Camillo's interests concern the Canada-US relationship and what the two neighboring countries can learn from their institutional and cultural differences. She came to Canada in 2015 as a Fulbright Fellow, and prior to that spent 25 years influencing, developing, and implementing American social policy from a number of positions, including grassroots organizer, policymaker, and politically appointed state program executive. So welcome, Dr. Camillo. Our final panelist is Dr. Lori Hosiger, who's associate professor and chair of the political science program at Boise State University. Dr. Hosiger's research focuses on the influence of a judge's background on their selection to courts and on judges' decision-making once on the court. She has published in both Canadian and American journals and is currently working on the 3rd edition of her Canadian Courts book and the 8th edition of an American Courts book. We're looking forward to a very interesting, welcome, Dr. Hosiger. And we're looking forward to a very entertaining and engaging discussion. And the order of the presentations will be Dr. Cheryl Camillo first, Dr. Lori Hosiger second, and Marshall Auerback to complete the panelist presentations. And with that, I'm now going to recede into the background and I pass it off to you, Dr. Camillo.
Thank you, Arjun, for moderating. And thanks to my fellow panelists for joining. I, too, am very much looking forward to the discussion, including with the participants. And I really appreciate all of you for taking time during the middle of the day to join this roundtable. Thank you, Alan and the Max Bell Foundation for sponsoring this. In my work in health policy making and research, I have found foundations to be essential to enhancing and facilitating policy reform. So thanks once again. I'd like to also thank one other group of people, and that is the state employees in several key states in the US who are currently working very, very hard to count all of the remaining votes and ballots. In the US, states often operate on a shoestring. And state employees have sometimes very difficult working conditions, and which is somewhat fueled by the anti-government sentiment that is general across the U.S. And so those people who stayed up all night counting the ballots might be people who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year at the most. And I really appreciate the work they're doing for the U.S. democracy. I'll try to keep my comments brief to get to that discussion period. I am mostly going to focus on US domestic policy and how I see things moving forward. I'll make a few comments about the election process before I talk about domestic policy. And at the end, I'll try to connect my comments about domestic policy to Canada. And I know my fellow panelists will complement my presentation quite well with their areas of expertise. And I should say that in addition to the experience that Arjun shared with you, I also have several years of experience as a political campaign professional in the US, including on presidential and Senate races. And as a lobbyist at the US Congress, where I was responsible for lobbying all of the Delaware offices, including Senator Joe Biden's office. So I'll draw from those experiences during my talk in the Q&A session. I have two main comments about the election process. One is related to a discussion we panelists were having informally before you all joined, which is the the anxiety and the frustration with sitting here now 2 days after Election Day, waiting for the results to come in. And my comment on that is that it's an example of why, when new technologies and policies are implemented, it's really important for policymakers and public administrators to communicate with the public about the impact of those policies and what implementation will be like. In many ways, we are now seeing more mail-in ballots and absentee voting because technology has improved. We tend, when we adopt technologies in the public sector, to emphasize the positives, the advantages of those technologies, but not communicate more broadly about the other impacts. And in this case, one of the other impacts is we may not know on Election Day what the results are. And so now we're seeing that Americans are feeling disappointed. They're almost feeling as if someone didn't tell them the way it was going to unfold. Yet, policymakers did know that, and the state folks running the elections systems did know that there was a possibility that it would take a while for votes to count. So I want to emphasize the importance of talking broadly about technology. My second comment is about the election season in the US. We are now almost 2 years into this presidential election. Most of the Democratic primary candidates who Joe Biden defeated started their campaigns in January 2019, if not earlier. It's a very long season. We're all worn out. Lots of money was spent. And I really, truly believe that the length of the season is very harmful to Americans, because what it does is it puts everyone in political mode, including the president of the United States, the incumbent who is running for re-election, while it's his personality and his style that he might have been in campaign mode regardless of the length of the election season. In general, no matter who the president is, the president has to be in campaign mode for 2 years. Putting energy into campaigns means you're not necessarily putting energy into governing, and the US needs strong governing more than ever. Many of the candidates running in the primaries were senators or sitting members of the House or elected officials in other offices. And again, their attention was to the politics and not governing. In Canada, we have maybe a 3-week, 30-day election season, and the issues are debated during that period. The candidates do become known. It does not need to be a 2-year period. And I believe a reform to shorten the election season can be done, certainly without any constitutional amendment, meaning without a united Congress. It can be done administratively, or at least at the state legislative level. And it's something that I think should be a priority. Moving to domestic policy, I'm going to make these comments with the assumption that Joe Biden is going to ultimately win this election and move into the White House on Inauguration Day on January 20th. It seems to be the way the votes are adding up. I acknowledge that that might not be the case ultimately, but my comments are going to assume that's the case. And I think there are 4 main tasks that Joe Biden has in front of him when he takes office. The first is to stop the COVID surge. Unfortunately, I very much believe that COVID will still be surging in the US in January. And it has tremendous impacts, including illness, death, financial, morale to the economy, and it needs to be stopped. It's going to be a very difficult thing to do for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is the health insurance system in the US has eroded over the last 4 years. The number of individuals who do not have health insurance has increased. The percentage of individuals has increased. It's now, depending upon the survey, it could be anywhere 10, 12%. And that has an impact. Many people did not get tested for COVID because they couldn't afford to. They were uninsured and they would have to pay for it. As a result, they got sick and they spread the virus to others. for Americans' health, we need health insurance reform. The third task is a president needs to restore the civil service in the US. It's been absolutely decimated in this administration, particularly at the State Department, where almost all the senior managers left. We're now seeing at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the public health agency of the United States, we're seeing an exodus there. I can tell you, having worked at the US Department of Health and Human Services for 10 years, that almost all of my former colleagues have left during this administration. There's very little experience left there to help develop health insurance reforms. So that needs to be rebuilt. But I think the biggest task, and I feel this in my heart, is that President Biden will need to address the deep divides in the United States. These divides are so deep, as we see. I think they're caused by four main forces. The US has been a very deeply segregated country from its beginning. And what helps increase that segregation is the housing and education policy. How most people live in areas where their neighbors look exactly like them, have income exactly like them. That's why when we see these ballots come in, when a particular county reports, most of the ballots will go toward one candidate because of that segregation. Social media is, I think, increasing the segregation, at least in communications, because now people, when they're communicating and getting information about public policies and campaigns, have ways to only talk to people like them, who think like them. The pandemic is furthering it by keeping people home, again, where when they look out the window, they only see people who look like them. And in general, the economic policy of the US over the last few decades is really causing some of those divides, because it is dramatically increasing inequality amongst people. This is not going to be an easy task for President Biden, but I think it is the number one thing he needs to invest in, and I'm confident he can do it. I, in many ways, see Joe Biden to be a Bill Clinton without the Southern drawl and the Rhodes Scholarship. He's very much a man of the people. He has a bit of an Appalachian twang in his accent, having grown up in northern Pennsylvania and Scranton. And he's folksy. You could see that when he spoke on election day, when he, to end his comments, talked about how when he left his grandparents' house to go back to Delaware, where he was living with his parents, his grandfather would say, "Now, Joey, keep the faith." And then his grandmother would say, "No, Joey, spread the faith." He has that kind of connection with people. I know this from lobbying him and working with him directly. And I do think he connects with your average working class, middle class American. And I think we're seeing some of that in the exit polls. In fact, if you look at exit poll results divided by income class, and that's self-reported, Biden has won everyone with a low level income and a middle class income. Where he's lost is people with high levels of income, that's over 100,000 US per year, and people whose financial situation has improved under Trump. So I do believe Biden can do this. Bill Clinton had a One America initiative that focused on race and created a dialogue on race, because he identified that as a really important thing to do in the US correctly, I think. Joe Biden's campaign slogan recently was "Restore the Soul of America." So I think he knows that he needs to do this. And I have great faith that he can. My last comments are that he will need the help of many strong, smart, innovative people around him. One of the critiques of Joe Biden is that he's old. He's been called Old Joe by Trump supporters. And he's been in government for 50 years. So he may be thought of as not having any new ideas. So I think his selection of Kamala Harris as a vice presidential candidate, and hopefully a new vice president, will maybe offer a new look to Americans, and she may be able to insert new ideas. But the cabinet choices will be really, really important for Biden. He's going to have to select people who have some experience with governing, especially since the US governance institutions need to be restored, but who will also really infuse with new ideas for taking the country forward. I said I would close with some comments about what all this means for Canada. I grew up and spent the first 21 years of my life literally a mile from the border in Buffalo, New York. And I've never seen Canadians walk away from America, from the US, and look to Americans with a lot of negative thoughts as they are doing now, what rightfully so. That friendship between the countries, that's not only one that's at a policy level, but is at a personal level, really does need to be restored. I think Joe Biden can do that. I think that's essential. It's also essential for the economies of places like my hometown. And I think it will make Canadians feel better as well, because right now Canadians are not only living next to an elephant, but an elephant that they're not sure is going to trumpet or roar or trample at any given time. And I think Canadians would appreciate some stability there. So thank you very much. And I'm going transfer the video camera to Lori Hausiger from Boise State University.
Thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate that. And thanks for having me. I am delighted to be back in Canada, at least virtually. A big thank you to the Max Bell Foundation for sponsoring this as well. My research is on the courts, so I tend to look at elections through that lens. So I'm going to say a few things about Trump and his influence on the courts that will mean, and what it will mean for the future, no matter who wins the presidency. Before I get into that, though, I did want to root my comments in the broader American political system. Cheryl mentioned it, and we've all heard about the American political system and how polarized it has become. So we see the effect of negative partisanship, where party loyalty is incredibly strong and people form their opinions in opposition to the views of the opposing party and have negative feelings towards that party. Lately, we've seen studies where Democrats fear their daughter bringing home a Republican more than any other identity, and Republicans are ready to never see their daughter again if their son-in-law is a Democrat. So there's real hostility, I think, among supporters for the other party, and that certainly played out in the states I've lived in as well. Party ID has become more closely aligned with ideology and social issues, so that parties aren't grouped together in the center left, center right. It's not Tweedledee, Tweedledum. They're diametrically opposed on a lot of issues. And that's, I think, reflected in some of the exit polls that we've seen from this election. When they ask voters what are the most important things happening, the most important issues facing the country, Democrats have been talking about climate change, the coronavirus, and racism. Republicans have been talking about abortion, immigration, and the economy. And it's not just the different issues that they're catching attention. It's this huge gap between them in their support. So if you look at those that mentioned climate change, 88% voted for Biden. And for those that talked about abortion being the most important issue, 89% voted for Trump. So we have distinctly different priorities going on here. And polarization and negative partisanship didn't start with Trump. These have been going on for a while, but he certainly stoked those divisions, and I think deepened them as well with some of his rhetoric. And we've seen an escalation among voters. I think that's been a dramatic change in the last 4 years. And that's reflected, I think, in a breakdown of conventions, and I don't just mean his Twitter account or the executive branch actions that are happening, but also in the way institutions like the Senate operate. So we've seen things that have actually affected the courts. So the lack of people ignoring blue slips suddenly for the first time in over 100 years, where home state senators used to have be able to block a court appointment they found objectionable to those lower courts. We've seen that most dramatically probably with the Supreme Court appointment that happened last month with Amy Coney Barrett, where there was a nomination just over a month before an election, and votes had already been cast by some. And that, of course, was completely constitutional for the Republicans to do, but was in direct contrast to some of their rhetoric from 4 years ago, and so created enormous controversy, given that they had refused to hold hearings on President Obama's choice to replace Scalia, which arguing it was an election year and people had already been voting in the primary, so 7 or 8 months before the election. So we saw a lot of bitterness and outrage from the Democrats at this nomination going ahead, and we saw a lot of appeals to the Constitution and to the nominees' qualifications from the Republicans. And the confirmation vote on Justice Barrett also reflects that polarization, I would argue. So her confirmation vote was almost entirely party line, with only one Republican voting no and no Democrats voting for her. So she ends up with a 52-48 vote. And you contrast that with Ginsburg with an 87-3, or I guess 87-9, or O'Connor, who was 99-0, Scalia 98-0. So polarization isn't just affecting elections, it's also affecting the institutions and how they operate. And it's deepened under Trump and will be unlikely to change no matter who wins the presidency from here. In terms of Trump's legacy, again, I think the courts have probably been the place he's been most effective. So Trump's inherited more lower court appointments than any president in recent memory, and he was very quick to fill them. And that means the courts have been remade, not just in terms of ideology, but also in terms of who sits on them. So if we look at trying to get more non-traditional appointees to the bench, women and people of color, Carter starts that. You see it damped down a bit with Reagan. It leaps up under Clinton, dips a bit with the second President Bush, and is huge again for Obama. That's actually, recent research has shown, that's actually gone negative now. So President Trump's not just putting white dudes on the bench, he's actually replacing women and people of color with white dudes, which makes for a very different bench. And if experience and background matter to judicial decision-making, like scholars believe it does, that means this is going to be a pretty significant change. So President Trump has a more ideologically friendly court system to make his arguments to. And he also has a system that may look at issues without as diverse amount of viewpoints to bring to it. All that's to say that President Trump's going to have a pretty lasting impact that will be difficult for the next president to change, whether it's Joe Biden or somebody 4 years from now. And if it is Biden, he's going to find it very difficult to get a lot done with an unfriendly Senate, an unfriendly court system, and what looks to be a few less seats in the House. It's also going to be a time where there could be some policy change that happens coming through state legislatures, which have become more Republican in a lot of areas. And with a friendly court system now, and a more conservative court system, and a Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative liberal vote spread, will probably be passing more things like restrictions on abortion to try to test that water and see how that goes. How does that affect Canada? Well, I think Trump hasn't really been a particularly close friend to Canada, and I know some felt that Biden would align better policy-wise. Some people perhaps wanted to rekindle the bromance of the Obama-Trudeau era, hoping that would lead to better policy considerations and a closer ties. But if Biden becomes president and is hamstrung by both an opposition Senate and a court that's more willing to strike down his policies, that closer tie might not actually result in particularly obvious benefits. So I'm going to leave some time for some questions, and so I'm going to end there and introduce Marshall. Marshall, take it away.
Thank you, Laurie. I want to first of all thank the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School Institute and the Max Bell Foundation, and also a thank you to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be on this event with all of you, and it's particularly nice to reconnect with my Canadian roots. I've lived for many years in the US, so have seen this from both sides, and I'll just share a few of my thoughts. First of all, I'll give a take on what was on the election itself. I agree with Cheryl and Laurie. The numbers seem to suggest that Joe Biden will be the next president. That's not a done deal, but it looks as we go through the counting, that's where things are likely to go. But I think it's important to note that this wasn't really supposed to be a close election. And I think it's also important to note that in many respects, this is the 2016 election all over again, give or take literally 100,000 votes or two. That's really what it comes down to. And this has happened against a backdrop of a pandemic where we've had depression-like levels of unemployment, a president whose approval rating never in his 4 years of office has risen beyond 50%. So that should have created the conditions for a so-called blue wave, both nationally and in the state houses. And yet it didn't. Even if Biden ekes out a victory in the Electoral College, his coattail effect is minimal. And this is ironic in one sense, because one of the ostensible rationales for the Democrats selecting a moderate like Joe Biden, as opposed to a progressive such as Bernie Sanders, was that there would be a stronger coattail effect. But actually, that's not likely to happen. As things stand today, the GOP will likely retain its majority in the Senate. And even though the Democrats will retain a majority in the House of Representatives after all the votes are counted, they're going to end up with one of the slimmest House majorities in 20 years. So I think in general, it's an unmitigated disaster for the Democrats. The voters, clearly, a lot of them were very unhappy with Trump, but they're not buying what the Democrats are selling either. And I think that's going to be a policy challenge for both parties going forward. I think it's important to realize that Trump is as much a consequence of pre-existing political dysfunction and economic dislocation as he is a cause. We've had persistent challenges that have been brought about by globalization and trade. We continue to make promises to the losers of globalization, and every election comes along and we don't do anything. And this is not just anymore a problem of, say, the proverbial white working class voters of the Rust Belt. In fact, one of the interesting things about the 2020 election is that there was also a significant erosion in Hispanic support for Biden in key states such as Texas and Florida, and corresponding gains with Republicans, including with working class Hispanics. So clearly, the coded racism and all the talk about the wall, it bothered some people, it didn't bother other groups. And I think the other factor is that you have two parties which are really in a state of policy flux. What it means to be a Democrat and what it means to be a Republican, it really doesn't correspond to your father's Democrats or your father or your mother's Republican Party. There has been a major migration of white educated voters over to the Democrats, and at the same time, a lot of the old working class blue collar workers have moved over to the Republicans. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even though Biden did pick up a significant amount of working class support, he wasn't able to reconstruct the old FDR style grand coalition that was so successful for many, many years for the Democrats. The Democrats have been increasingly dominated by the donor classes of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and their policy priorities have reflected increasingly the policy priorities of those groups, and they have not done very much for the working class people that they ostensibly are supposed to represent. And the appeal about Trump in 2016 was that he, at least rhetorically, addressed the concerns of those people. He did so again in this election, and even though I would agree that he didn't do much for them, there are still people that we have to remember that even in advance of the pandemic, the economic numbers were pretty good. You had full employment, and Democrats really have to ask themselves that, but for COVID-19, whether this would have actually been a close election. You have to understand that even in areas where there has been stagnant economies combined with poor income inequality in states like Alaska, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Iowa, Utah, Michigan, it bothers people that there is this economic stagnation in terms of their relative position to other groups in society. I think what bothers them has been the fact that they've been ignored for a long period of time. We've had broad industrial decay caused by automation, the offshoring of manufacturing to countries with cheaper labor. That's entailed, in turn, has created lots of urban decay, rising criminality, opioid addiction, economic insecurity. And neither party has been fundamentally able to address that. They haven't been able to address the problems of what I call the growing precariat. It's interesting to me that one of the side features of this election is that a state like California, the bluest of the blue states, a large Democratic state, also massively passed Proposition 22, which is will effectively retain the independent contractor classification in labor law, and that in turn will undermine many of the hard-earned benefits that normally accrue to employees when they work for a company. So we're going back to we have a 21st century kind of a digital chain gang kind of economy, a neo-feudalism. And again, this is happening in a state like California. California is the state that often leads the nation, and the fact that this thing has passed is very disturbing to me, and I think it's going to be something that's going to have to be addressed. The other problem is that, I had hoped that when the next economic crisis came, that we would be able to address some of the concerns, inequality, and economic stagnation that had afflicted the country for several decades. I think it's worth recalling that the Great Depression did temporarily incapacitate the country's economic royalists, as FDR called them, and he was able to fundamentally alter the American economic landscape. Unfortunately, Obama did not do this in 2008. He didn't secure a new governing coalition in the process. And sadly, COVID-19 has actually exacerbated many of the pre-existing problems that we have in the United States. If you look at a recent survey of 37 countries, it indicated that 3 in 4 households suffered declining income since the start of the pandemic. 82% of the poorest households were affected. 2 million more people claim that they don't have enough to eat, and the wealthy have just got wealthier. Healthcare access is largely a function of income and zip code, as Cheryl had mentioned earlier. And this is a problem in the United States in particular because many basic forms of economic security are tied to employment rather than being universal goods as they are here in Canada. So if you are working self-employed in the so-called gig economy, where there's reciprocal protections and benefits afforded by a traditional employer practice are no longer there because of the independent contractor classification that I've talked about, then you are in a very, very dire position today. And it's also worth noting that the relief packages that were introduced in the wake of the government-led shutdown have run out. And so I think you're going to see very, very poor numbers going forward. Now, I think in spite of that, there is a way forward for Biden. I do think that it's time for people to reconsider an old-fashioned concept, national industrial policy. I think that has to focus on industrial regeneration in the United States. I think the issue about the vulnerability of global supply chains and the unraveling of the nexus with China, those will probably be good things for the country. They need to be continued. I think we have to rethink many of the traditional assumptions about free trade, because I think trade is largely, in my opinion, a distributional issue. It has helped certain people in the economy, but it has not helped everybody. And I think those distributional aspects have to be, one has to pay heed to them more in the future. That might entail not necessarily tariff-like protectionism, but you may need to reconsider things like domestic content requirements to help facilitate local employment. I know that this is regarded as heresy by free trade theologians, but the reality is that comparative advantage is a 19th century concept. It's often a product these days of government-led industrial policy. East Asia has clearly showed that in its own historic leap to economic prosperity, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing the same in North America. So I think those are some of the things that have to be thought out. I think as far as Canada goes, yes, Trump has not really been a friend to Canada, and I think Biden will present a more comfortable, and predictable framework for Canadians going forward. But I do think that many of the trends that Trump has set in motion will be continued by Biden. I think there will be a tendency to more nationalism, regionalism in trade. The United States is losing its relative preeminence as the global hegemon, and I think increasingly both the European Union and indeed Asia will go their own way. So trade is going to become multipolar, regionalized, and that could be good for Canada. It will have to accept being part of it, the junior partner in a larger North American trade relationship, but I think that's nothing new for the country. My only other concern about a Biden presidency is that if you look, he has a considerable number of the old style conservative neocons from the Bush Republican era supporting him, along with a lot of never Trump Republicans, and they could well secure prominent influence in the area of foreign policy. Trump, for all of his flaws, I think did push back against the proclivity of Americans to of American foreign policy to embrace militarization. I think that's been a real problem over the last 20 years. And my concern is that some of the people that he's likely to have in his foreign policy establishment, even though they are predictable and familiar to Canadians, they are embracing a form of foreign policy interventionism that I think has proved in the past, that has proved highly destructive to the United States. It's time for the United States to focus on reviving its homegrown economy, its homegrown industries, and spend less time dealing with foreign policy adventurism going forward. So I think I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion on some of these points, and I'll bring it over to you, Arjun. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Marshall, and thank you, Lori, and thank you, Cheryl, each of you for your presentations. It looks like we have we're about at the halfway mark, so we're going to have a chance for very rich question and answer period. And I can see questions rolling in right now, and as they continue to roll in, I'll get to them, but I'm going to take advantage of my position as a moderator to get the ball rolling and to ask a few questions to our panelists. So the first thing I want to start with is if we're following the news, and I think most people are, of the U.S. elections and seeing how close the races are, and the Trump administration now filing a series of lawsuits in regards to the counting of ballots. So the question is it suggests that the courts will be involved at some point or another. So maybe I can turn this question over to Lori Hosiger and just ask about what might the court's involvement look like in terms of shaping or determining the outcomes of the election. And if you could also maybe speak to the broader implications that the court's involvement in the election might have in the current and future state of American democracy.
Yeah, President Trump's already filed, I think, 3 lawsuits. I think he's going after Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia already, and talking about others. He wants a recount in Wisconsin, but he's moving a little earlier than we've seen in the past, and so that's interesting. I think this obviously is only, court cases are only going to happen in these battleground states, right? Only in these states where the number of votes would be close enough to have this matter. And so it's a little early to know whether or not there is a close enough margin on these states for him to actually get any action in a court case. The lower courts and federal courts in general have been respecting kind of state sovereignty a little. So some of the complaints that he's having have to do with, well, Pennsylvania, for example, with the fact that the ballots are arriving on election day and being allowed to count till Friday. They're keeping those separate. He wants those not counted. But with this kind of comes down to what we mean in terms of voting, right? And whether or not the state legislature's making these rules, or the Secretary of State, or whatever. Some of this is coming down to pretty finite things. I would expect this to play out. It's going to take a while to see if the votes are close enough for it to matter. I think he's moving a little quickly here. The other thing, this federal courts and the Supreme Court in particular are very sensitive to their role in the political arena. And with Roberts as Chief Justice, I think that's going to play in a little bit too. He's very concerned about the legitimacy of the court. He's very concerned about credibility. And so because Trump's saying he's going to go to the Supreme Court. Well, he's got a long way to go to get to the Supreme Court. So he's got to make these arguments in states that have a close vote. It's going to have to show that there's enough to actually make a difference. If Biden wins by enough, it won't matter a whit. We do have more conservative courts, we have seen him get some victories. If it makes it up to the Supreme Court, he has the 6-3. I don't know what Justice Barrett will do, but I imagine I'd be curled up in the fetal position if I was her at this point, because if she steps in, that's awkward, given her trajectory to the court. If she doesn't step in, so if she doesn't participate, they get to decide themselves whether they recuse. So it's a gong show is what I'm gonna say. I don't see how he has the arguments or the close enough votes to make this work, but he will obviously try. And I think it'll be fascinating to watch Justice Barrett and Justice Roberts if he does. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I think gong show captures a lot of what is going on right now. I just want to maybe shift gears a little bit now to Cheryl Camillo. So you grew up in Buffalo, I grew up in Montreal, close to Burlington and Plattsburgh too. So I know that this kind of cross-border travel is kind of common growing up on these, when you're about an hour, a couple hours away from the American border. As a Montrealer too, though, now that I know you're from Buffalo, that makes us natural hockey rivals. But just to kind of follow up as something you were talking about, think about the comparative perspective, the US-Canada comparative perspective within the context of our current context. And we've seen two different approaches of trying to reconcile addressing the pandemic as a public health issue and restarting the economy. So we've seen a Canadian approach and an American approach. And the question I have is, maybe one way of putting it is there a possibility for the United States to adopt a Canadian approach, or is there another approach in the United States of kind of dealing with these two issues that seem to be at loggerheads currently in many parts of the US?
Thanks for that great question. And by the way, the Montreal Canadiens are my second favorite team. They're like my 1B team. I would respond to your question first by saying, I think the US and Canadian responses aren't as different or unlike as you posed. I would say they're both alike in that most officials at the political level have presented recovery from the pandemic as a question of public health versus stimulating the economy. And I would go on to argue that's harmful, but I don't want to go down that road just yet. Where I think there has been difference is that Canadians have demonstrated, for the most part, faith in their public health officials and faith in governance, and that's been reinforced by Canadian officials. Whereas in the US, you have the executive of the United States undermining public health officials constantly, even threatening to fire Dr. Fauci after the election, which he technically can't do, but he might do anyway. And that has fed into the traditional anti-government sentiment that many Americans have, and has led to Americans not complying with the public health restrictions. So I think that's the difference. I do think a Biden administration would attempt to restore faith in government and back public health officials. But it will take constant messaging and a lot of reinforcement. I like the question of the comparison of US-Canadian health policy, though, because it allows me to get back to the border that you started the question with by mentioning. And that's one advantage of a strong relationship between Canada and the US, I see, and it's been my experience, is that when there's a familiarity at the individual, at the personal level between Canadians and Americans, I think there's an opportunity then to understand more deeply than at the soundbite level how policies differ, despite the fact that people living in the two countries are pretty similar, certainly much more similar than, say, Americans and folks in other continents, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to restore the relationship between the two countries, because we do benefit from learning about each other's policies and then adapting some of those policies to our own political contexts.
Great. Thank you very much, Cheryl. And this is the last question I'm going to use as my privilege as a moderator to shift gears to Marshall Auerback, who's from Toronto, and I realize now it's probably more of a natural rival to a Montrealer than that is.
I don't know if I should answer your question.
No,
now.
Of course, no. We're all Canadian at the end of the day, right? So it's just within the context of, and what you brought up is what seems to be the direction that the American elections are heading into is a divided government. And within the context of a divided government, sort of want to kind of continue how you concluded your presentation and talking about the future of economic policy and fiscal policy in the United States within the context of a divided government, but particularly with the kind of a maybe to narrow the gap a little bit to, it's from a very broad question, to maybe a couple of issues. And one is the feasibility or possibility of the enactment of a Green New Deal, assuming a Biden presidency and a divided government. And secondly, the possibility or the feasibility of other forms of major forms of economic innovation under a divided government.
Yeah, I think that a Green New Deal with a Mitch McConnell-led Senate is DOA. It'll be eviscerated. It is possible that some aspects of it could be pushed in the context of a broader public infrastructure program. That to me is feasible. And God knows the U.S. needs an upgrade of its public infrastructure. I think the last report I saw from the civil engineers gave it about a D+. So that would be important, and I think you could marry some of the environmental objectives in that sort of a context. Then that leads to the broader question of fiscal policy. Are the Republicans going to turn again into born-again fiscal hawks, which they seem to do only when Democrats are in the White House? That I think is going to be harder for them to do, given that there will be the need for immediate relief. I think when the data comes out in the fourth quarter, it's going to be pretty disastrous. I think the benefits of the last CARES package, as inefficiently distributed as it was, have pretty well dissipated, and you're going to start seeing some fairly ugly numbers. So I think political pressures will grow on both sides of the aisle. It's true that Mitch McConnell, when Barack Obama was president, said that his goal was to make him a one-term president, and he may have the same objective as regard to Biden. There are 2 points I would make, however. One is that the Senate majority is likely to be very small, if at all. We're going to have the runoffs in Georgia. So it's possible that he won't have one. The other thing is, I wouldn't underestimate the power of presidential aspiration for some of the other Republicans now that Trump is off the scene. I think you've got people like Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who are, at least on domestic policy, very, very different sorts of Republicans than the traditional Romney or even Reagan-esque supply-siders. They like to think of themselves as blue-collar populists, and I think that there would be a possibility of securing some support from them for a national developmental policy. And the final thing I would say is that the GOP has started to focus increasingly on China as a geopolitical, or at least an economic threat. A lot of Democrats also buy into that. Biden, I don't think not so much, but he is from Scranton, Pennsylvania, so has been noted, and I think he is concerned about the deindustrialization of the country. He's seen it with his own eyes. So I can envisage that you could maybe marry some sort of Hamiltonian national industrial policy meld it with some sort of national security component, so you have dual use industries. And I think also in addition to that, the pandemic has highlighted that there are certain strategic and economic vulnerabilities if you don't have a sufficient manufacturing done onshore. So I think priorities of redundancy and resiliency have to be re-established in the United States. And in that regard, Biden might get some support from the GOP side of the aisle. And he'll certainly get it from people like Chris Coons and Mark Warner, who I think will be very important figures on the Democratic side in the new Senate.
Thank you very much, Marshall, and thank you, Cheryl and Lori. And I think one of the great advantages of a panel like this and our panelists' great answers is that I think, being a political scientist, I have friends and family members coming to see me and saying, well, what's going on in the US? Can you explain and can you do that? And now I have three additional rich explanations that I can draw on to answer questions that are beyond my area of expertise. And so now I'm going to sort of let go of my privilege as moderator and shift gears over to questions from the audience. And we have one here. So this is how it goes. To what degree has growing inequity destroyed trust in our political processes, and thus, or as a result, people are voting for someone who isn't a politician and has little to no integrity? So maybe kind of another way of looking at this is can the rise of Trump be, I'm assuming that the question is related to Trump here, can that be sort of related to the disappearing middle class? So I'd like to turn that over to our panelists.
I'll respond to that first, if I may. I think it's a fascinating question, a really important one, and one I've thought a lot about. And I may not answer it directly initially, but hopefully I will at the end. I would say one of the phenomena we see in the United States is that thoughts about race and ethnicity and immigration status are also very much intertwined with thoughts and notions about who's working and how much they're working and who gets what from what government programs. And what's becoming increasingly clear, perhaps because of that underlying anti-government sentiment or a poor education system, is that Americans really don't understand. A fascinating thing I learned when running state public health insurance programs that provided benefits is that every American is honestly almost obsessed with others getting more than they're getting and not working as hard as they are working. So given all this misinformation, Americans do, I think, tend to be attracted toward political leaders, especially demagogues like Trump, who develop really crude, simplistic messages to basically attack those who Americans think are getting more than they're getting, and to feed into that. I think that's a lot of the phenomenon there, which is why I suggest that the #1 task of the new president is to reconcile America very broadly.
I'll take a crack at that as well. I think it is a good question, and I agree with it. The premise that, as I was saying in my presentation, I think Trump is as much consequence as cause, and I think the reality is that there has been massive growing inequality for the last 40 years. It's been a bipartisan phenomenon. Neither party has really addressed it, which is why we keep getting these changes. And the 2000 was a change election, 2004, 2006, 2008. 2016, they're all change elections. We keep going back and forth with the parties, hoping that someone will address the underlying issues. It's interesting because the Republicans like to speak of security from the point of view of guns or the military and making sure we're safe externally. Democrats like to talk about economic security, but and they champion redistribution programs that they channel from the winners to the losers. But they neither party really deal with the structural problems at the heart of the growing inequality. And so my concern is that if Biden doesn't address this, that you could get a more extreme and indeed a more competent version of Trump next time, and that would be very, very scary. So I think you have to make the argument probably less on moral grounds, even though I think those are very important. I think the argument has to be that our economy cannot grow as efficiently and as robustly if more and more of the gains are channeled to a small number of people, especially those with the highest savings propensities. And so I think that's got to be the focus of broadening the prosperity in order to maximize the economy's potential. And I think Biden is temperamentally capable of doing that in a way that Trump was not. So that's one hopeful thing about his presidency.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think Trump's not unique, right? There was this kind of person was showing up elsewhere in the world. And so I think you get the financial crises, you get those things, it leads an opening for this kind of, people like to have someone to blame, right? There's always someone, and they tend to blame the people doing worse than them rather than the folks at the top that are doing pretty darn well. So I think that's definitely something that has to be addressed. I think the education system is actually one of the drivers in inequality as well. If you take a look at higher education right now, I have a kid applying for college right now, and places, big public schools like the University of Colorado, $57,000 a year for room and board and tuition. And the enterprise of actually, every American thinks that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everybody can be president. And I think it's never been less true. And there's a lot of obstacles along the way that make it incredibly difficult for people to take advantage of the systems that actually would help elevate you. So higher education being one. It's actually incredibly difficult to know all the things you should do to make sure you can be competitive for higher education. First gen people, I don't know how they figure anything out, because it is not made to be easy. And the folks that have money pay people to help their kid get into college, to walk this application process. So there's actual companies involved. So yeah, I think there's just widespread issues that are deepening. And Biden, I think, but going back to the earlier question, I'm not actually sure Biden wants to pass something like the Green Deal. He is more pragmatic, he is more moderate, and this kind of situation where he's facing an opposition Senate might actually serve him pretty well in getting the policies that he wants to push. He can put more centrist people in and say, darn it, I can't get those other folks in, and so forth.
I think the next question that we have from the audience kind of follows up very, very nicely from this concluding point and speaks to the idea of political parties, the two major political parties, as to whether they're now at a juncture where they have to reimagine and reinvent themselves, and how feasible will this actually be? So the question is, given the quote unquote unmitigated disaster for the Democrats, what will be the likely outcome of the Democratic Party itself? Will it fracture and go through a period of internal strife? And I'd just like to add to this question is, what about the Republican Party too, depending on the outcome?
I guess since I was the one that said it was an unmitigated disaster, I should go first. Look, I think this is a long-standing trend. Philip Kitchell and Herbert Wren wrote a piece last year which talked about the migration of college-educated peoples to the Democratic Party, and that's been continuing. And I think Michael Lind has also written an excellent book on this, talked about the control of the increasing dominance of the professional managerial class and its role in the Democratic Party. So as I was saying earlier, what it means to be a Democrat is very different from what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and indeed the Republican Party too. I think there is a large chunk of the population, the working class population, which is up for grabs right now. If you were to assume existing trends, ironically, it's more likely that the Republicans get hold of them, seize them, as opposed to the Democrats. They do have progressives in their party, but you have a substantial, a very, very powerful donor class base, which still dominates the party machinery. That's the same in both parties. And I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. The reason, paradoxically, why I thought it might be easier for the Republicans to secure this blue collar support is precisely because they also have historically they've had the bigger national security hawks, and they've always been big spenders in the military. That's something that seems to get strong bipartisan support. So it is possible that they could sort of meld what I would call a national development mentalist philosophy with military-style Keynesian, much as Reagan did, for example, in the 1980s, and was a formidably successful president. Whether you agreed with his objectives or not, he was a transformational president. And I think that's a possibility for the GOP, especially now that, as it appears likely, Trump is no longer on the scene. So elements of Trumpism may survive Trump. That's the point, and I don't know what the Democratic response will be to that.
I'll just add to this that I don't see this election as being an unmitigated disaster for the Democrats. I see it as another example of the tension there always has been between the moderate ruling wing and some of the traditional groups that have supported the party and voted Democrat, like unions. I think it's a continuation of a trend where that conflict may be a little more intense. And I think that has everything to do with the economic change that we've been seeing and that each of us has touched on in this. And that doesn't, even though I don't think it's an unmitigated disaster, and I do think it's going to be a very difficult thing to address, because if the party truly wants to engage in change that will benefit the country, it has to reconcile with these cries of socialism, communism, which I think are ludicrous. I can never imagine the United States adopting either of those economic or political systems, but still they're going to have to counter that. And I'll suggest that one way to do so might be to adopt more democratic socialist policies, such as give everybody health insurance. One thing that's absolutely true is that, and this kind of touches on the comments I made earlier, when Americans get benefits, they love those benefits and they don't want to give them back. So even though Trump has run against the Affordable Care Act, including in this election, voters in many new states, very conservative southern states that are very red, supported a Medicaid expansion, which was enabled by the Affordable Care Act. And that's an expansion of public health insurance for those who aren't familiar with the Medicaid program.
I'm not sure I would say unmitigated disaster either. I think it depends a little bit on what your measures are, right? And so what things that, I think there's bright spots in this election. I think seeing the vote turnout is certainly exciting. Seeing more women elected than ever before, I find exciting. Seeing a lot more diverse candidates, seeing a gain for women within the Republican Party, because traditionally when we've talked about the year of the women, it's really just the year of the Democratic women. And it looks like the Republican women have made a bit insight here too. So in terms of the Democratic Party, well, I think maybe 2010 might have been worse, but we'll see with the midterms there, how that goes. And we'll see once all the votes are counted, how bad it is. I think that there was a lot of optimism because of polling. So some of this seems particularly disheartening given what people thought for Democrats, thinking about what they thought going into this election. And I think that's super fascinating, just the polling question as well. I mean, just the when you see it laid out and the underrepresentation of Trump, it's dramatic across all the states except maybe 4. I think the one chart I saw where they underestimated Biden in Hawaii and some of those things. But I'm wondering if we're now in a state, my public opinion colleagues talk about, where the Republicans are more distrustful of media, more distrustful of talking to people like polls, and so we just can't ever kind of get where we were. So being more accurate. So I don't know how much is this the expectations, I guess, is what I would say, Marshall.
You could be right. By the way, I will put in a plug. There is a Canadian company called Rewe in Toronto, a Toronto-based company that actually called was far more accurate on the polling than almost any American company I know. They were a good go-to source for me, and they actually predicted that Trump would win, but it was pretty well as tight as they indicated, and I think so. I'll give a little shout out to them. That polling is possible to do, but the methodology that most use is pretty awful.
So thank you, Marshall, for the segue, because we have polling is a big question here, and so there's several questions that we've gotten from the audience regarding polling. So I'll try and kind of collapse them to a couple of kind of key points or key questions that come up. The first one is so why? So what explains why polling seems to be a good indicator for popularity of candidates, but not a reflection of actual electoral results? So what is it that, so shifting gears from political parties themselves, maybe to voters themselves, so with these questions, so what are we not understanding, or what are we not getting right about American voters? What are these polls missing really within that context? So maybe I'll start with that, and there's a couple of other polling related questions, but the big one is what are they missing?
All right. Well, I haven't looked at this pretty closely. Part of it is that the traditional means of polling, through phoning, especially landlines, and is tough. You have to do it much more online and in the internet. This company I mentioned is actually very, very good at that, and they access a much broader base of people that aren't normally captured in these polls. You normally have a traditional group of people that are polled, and there's a good 20-30% that are constantly missed out. So that's one complicating factor that needs to be addressed. The internet has to be used in a much more intelligent way. The other problem is that, as Laurie pointed out, there were very significant changes in how we voted in this election. That's actually a very good thing. Historically, I think one of the reasons why the U.S. has had such low turnouts is because there are tremendous structural impediments to voting, many of which were eliminated during this election, maybe for reasons of the pandemic. I sincerely hope that the country continues to move in this way, because I think that is one of the best things about the election, that you did have this increased turnout, but the infrastructure for handling that is still archaic and needs to be improved. But the point is that in regard to polling is that it makes it much more problematic, because polls, historically, they give you snapshots of public opinions, which is fine when you have one big voting day on November the 3rd. But by November the 3rd this year, we had 100 million Americans who had already voted over a period of weeks. So to me, I likened it like capturing splicing out a bit of something out of a film reel, and then trying to guess what the whole film was going to be like while it was ongoing, because you've just taken one splice out of a section of film. And I think that's the challenge that the pollsters had this time, and I don't think that most of them had the right technology to use it. So that's why we missed a lot of these voters again.
Yeah, I would think that they're going to defend themselves. They probably got the national vote pretty close, right? It's when you splice down to these, trying to predict, and in a place that depends on electoral college, you got to splice down, right? And that's where it gets very difficult. Think about the last time you actually voluntarily answered your phone when you didn't recognize the number. And so their response rates, I think, are 2 to 5% or something dismal, where they are really having to drag. And we know in 2016 they got it wrong in the Midwest, and they attributed a lot of that to undersampling the lesser educated and overestimating African-American turnout. So turnout is probably going to be a big driver here too. I don't think people were so focused on the get out to vote on the Democrats. I don't think they saw the Republican surge that went with it. So if you're undersampling Republicans, your polls are going to be problematic. And I just think it's incredibly difficult to get the good samples in these small, increasingly smaller units that you need to do if you want to predict the electoral college vote.
You can, but it has to be done through, you have to use the modern day technology. It is, this company I mentioned goes to rural areas in India and China and get access. So you can do it, but it's, as I say, that it's using the technology in an intelligent way. Most of the existing polling companies don't do it properly. So that's why they're going to continue to have this problem going forward, I think.
Yeah, I've seen people talk about whether they need to start going back door to door rather than trying to phone. But everything's just very expensive, right, to change it around. So
I mostly agree with what Laurie and Marshall have to say. I would just add one thing, which is I wonder if the polls, and I'll say that I haven't read a lot of the polls that got it wrong and the actual questions they asked, but I wonder if they're not tapping into individuals' motivations that lead to their final choice, because there can often be a disconnect between the party you're registered with, your position on the issues, but how you'll vote if you're going to vote in your self-interest. So a perfect example is, I know many Trump supporters in my own family and elsewhere who are very much believe that Medicare and Social Security are sacred programs, and would normally be against the policies that the Trump administration started to execute, which is to undermine those programs by eliminating the revenue source of those programs. But in the case of many people I know, they were still going to cast that vote for Trump because they were factoring in, well, by the time the revenue's gone, I'll be dead anyway. So I'm still going to get my benefits for the next 20 years. So here's a vote for Trump. It's very much a vote in the self-interest. And I'm not sure the polls captured that kind of calculation.
Every one of these questions that we're asking could evolve into its own discussion, or for over an hour and a half. And so we've started with parties. We've now gone to voters, and we'd be remiss, particularly within the context of JSGS, if we didn't talk about policy. So there's a couple of policy questions that I'd like to ask the panelists right now. So I'm gonna put a couple of them together. So the first one is whether the panelists have any projections as to how agricultural trade might be impacted, assuming a Biden win. And then we also have a question on foreign policy, which is, if Biden becomes president, do any of the panelists foresee any reversals in foreign policy related to Israel, Iran, and/or Russia? So agricultural trade policy and foreign policy as it relates to Israel, Iran, or Russia, assuming a Biden victory.
Who do you want to start?
I'm going to stay in my lane and defer to you. These are out of my lane.
I'll ask I would think on agriculture, if it's Biden, you'll get something approaching a more predictable and less hostile pattern. There is, as I said, I think Canadians in general will have to get used to more of an America First mentality in general. I do think that's been bipartisanized to some degree. The Americans used to see a coincidence between their interests and globalization when they were the dominant global hegemon. That's no longer the case. So of course, I think that's likely to induce some rebalancing and greater economic nationalism, even on security grounds. On foreign policy, Biden was part of an administration that did make an overture to Iran. It may be the Iran overture, maybe the Iran hostility might dissipate somewhat, but Trump has created facts on the ground with these peace treaties amongst various Arab countries, which have occurred with the implicit sanction and approval of Saudi Arabia. So I think it's going to be hard to shift dramatically in that regard. I hope that policy vis-a-vis Russia does improve, because I think regardless of what you think of their involvement in the US election, I mean, Americans have been interfering in other countries' democracies for ages, so it's nothing new. But I would say that this is the country with the second largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, and I don't think it behooves the country to embrace a new kind of Cold War mentality with the Russians. And I suspect that once the toxicity of Trump's presidency is out of the way, Russian relations could improve somewhat. It's interesting to me that no one's been talking about Putin interfering with the results, at least so far. Maybe if Trump wins again, that'll change. But I think that's an encouraging thing, and maybe that will that aspect of the democratic policy will start to mitigate somewhat.
I would only add a comment on the foreign policy, which is, I think if Biden does enter the White House, we will see less of a flirtation with the dictators around the world, less of a bromance.
Yeah.
So parties, voters, policy, now institutions. All right, so this is a question, kind of goes back to Marshall's earlier point about the likelihood or the probability of if Biden becomes president, the be president of a divided government at that point. And one of the questions from our audience is what is the likelihood of a functional or dysfunctional relationship between the executive and legislative branch under a divided government, under a Biden presidency? And sort of maybe to add on to that, kind of more generally, assuming Biden is president, what will Trump's influence be beyond, as no longer being president, on that relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, if there'll be any?
Well, I think it can't be less dysfunctional, right? I mean, there's all sorts of, or it can't be more dysfunctional, I guess is the word I was going for. But I think one of the key things is the executive branch is a bit of a mess right now. There is vacancies in a variety of agencies. There's this info vacuum with all the experts that left. They haven't been enforcing some regulations on the books. There's accusations of corruption. So I think that the executive branch itself will probably be one of the first areas that Biden would pay some attention to, and where he can have a big impact. We know agencies, right, have a lot of independent stuff they're doing besides, I mean, there's a reason it's called the fire alarm model for Congress overseeing them, right? They don't see a whole lot. So agencies are important, and I think they've been decimated under the Trump administration. And I think Biden's style is, if I don't see a lessening of polarization myself, but I think if anybody can actually work with other people, it's Joe Biden. I mean, that's his trademark, right? That's what he campaigns on. That's what the approach he takes. And I don't think he's an extreme. I think he's a pretty moderate fellow. So again, I think he would have better luck there than most.
I think Trump won't have much of an influence on the institutions. I think he'll still have an influence in the ears of certain Americans, those who are his big Trump supporters now with the MAGA hats. I don't think he's ever been interested in the institutions other than to smote people who aren't, doing what he wants them to do, like Anthony Fauci. I think the big governance problem will be if Mitch McConnell continues as Senate Majority Leader. That's going to make it very difficult for any legislation to be enacted. I disagree with some of my panelists, or perhaps they disagree with me, I should say, is I do think Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi would be good leaders of the respective chambers of Congress on the Democratic side moving forward, because they have experience, they're legislators to their core. And regarding the executive branch, I would be remiss in if I didn't say, as a public administration scholar at the Johnson Shoyama School, that there's a real opportunity for scholars here to help restore the executive branch and public administration in the US. And I'm somewhat encouraged that will happen, because among the many writing letters to the voters prior to the election were public administration scholars who were sounding the alarm about some of the proposed decimation of the civil service that the Trump administration has on the table. So I'm encouraged by, and I hope the scholars will step forward with ideas.
I don't have much to add to that, other than to say that if anybody could improve the workings between the Congress and the presidency, it would be Biden. He's a creature of the Senate. He was there for 47 years, and he has good relations on both sides of the aisles. That was disparaged during the campaign, but I do think that that's going to be necessary. He is temperamentally suited for it. As I said, McConnell. He did say when Obama was president that his goal was to make him a one-term president. The environment was very different at that point. I think also the fact that you had this strange man with a strange sounding name who had the wrong color skin motivated his action here. You've got a nice, it's good old Joe from Scranton, Pennsylvania. So there's less incentive. And then in addition to that, you are, as was pointed out earlier, still in the midst of a pandemic and a major economic crisis. And Congress does tend to be a little bit less dysfunctional vis-a-vis the White House in that kind of an environment, along with the fact that Biden will have some political capital in his the first few months of his presidency. So I think it will work together at least for the next several months, 6 to 9 months. Then his power will start to drain away, as normally happens when you get to the congressional cycle. As far as the presidency itself, it's become a much more powerful position. And that's been the case no matter who's been in office. The candidates always come in saying they're going to restore power to Congress. They never do. The other big issue will be the courts, as Laurie has pointed out. And I do think that this issue about court expansion is not going to be off the table, especially if you get some controversial judgments. I think there is some possibility of significant institutional reform because it's become a highly politicized branch of government, even though it likes to claim that it is independent. Laurie might have more to say about that. That's certainly my impression.
Yeah, I don't know that Biden has the stomach for expansion, but there's certainly been growing calls in the legal community for term limits and for the federal judges, because, you know, lifetime appointments aren't what they were in the 1700s. And so I think that is where I could see more. I think Biden will be distracted by some of the other things happening. Obama didn't move very quickly on justice, and I'm not sure that, I mean, the Democrats have tended not to, their voters have not put the same emphasis on courts that Republican voters understand. Courts are an issue here when you have an election. So I'm not sure that that'll be where he goes first. He talked about a bipartisan commission to try to figure out what to do with the courts. I don't know if expansion would be it, but I think there's traction being gained on something, perhaps term limits or at least a retirement age.
The one reason the Democrats might pay attention to the courts is that's where a lot of social policy in the US is actually advanced, is through the courts, the civil rights and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender rights. And those interest groups will continue to reinforce that point.
Yeah, and you see that, right? You see that in these issues that they're championing. The things that are important to them and help their vote tend to be things that relate to the court.
This brings us up to 228, 229 right now, and to the end, unfortunately, to the end of this very rich conversation and this dialogue. And I want to thank our panelists, Laurie, Marshall, and Cheryl, very much for this wonderful conversation. As I said, very rich discussion and very rich answers to some very good questions. And I'd like to thank the audience members for joining us today and for asking their questions too, on behalf of myself and on behalf of JSGS. And I would ask everybody here to please join me by using the reaction option to applaud our panelists right here and to thank them once again for joining us.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. You were an excellent moderator.
Thank you. Well, listen, it's always easy when you have great panelists.